Loring Air Force Base was the first Strategic Air Command base built entirely from scratch. Before Loring, SAC had converted World War II Army Air Corps bases into SAC bases. The site for Loring Air Force Base was chosen not by accident, but rather because of its proximity to the Soviet Union. A separate Air Force station was designed and built while Loring itself was being constructed. This Air Force station would become the first, and by far, the largest operational nuclear weapons stockpile site in the United States. Simply stated, Loring Air Force Base was designed and built to store, maintain, and transport nuclear weapons by cargo type and heavy bomber aircraft. It was the purpose and mission of the base, and Loring Air Force Base would fulfill that mission from 1952 until 1988. In May of 1988, Ronald Reagan was President of the United States. The Air Force Chief of Staff was General Larry D. Welch. The Commander of Strategic Air Command was General John T. Chain, Jr. On May 16, 1988, an article was published in the New York Times titled, "3 Nuclear Storage Depots to Close as B-52 Missions Change," by Richard HALLORAN, special to the New York Times. The Air Force had notified congressional leaders through correspondence that it had planned to close 3 depots where nuclear weapons were stored at air bases, as some B-52 bombers were being converted to carry only conventional bombs. In letters to lawmakers, the Air Force said nuclear storage depots would be closed at Andersen Air Force Base on Guam in the Central Pacific Ocean, Loring Air Force Base in northern Maine, and Mather Air Force Base near Sacramento, California. In addition, the storage of nuclear weapons at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana would be reduced, the Air Force said. But it did not say where the nuclear weapons from all 4 bases would be moved to. In the letters, the Air Force said the storage depots would be closed in fiscal year 1989, which began on October 1st, 1988. The closures would free more than 1,200 members of the Air Force, mostly security police officers, around the heavily guarded sites for duties elsewhere. The exact number of Air Force nuclear storage sites was not made public in accordance with the Defense Department's policy of neither confirming nor denying the presence of nuclear weapons. Most of the Strategic Air Command's 25 bases in the United States, Western Europe, and the Pacific were believed to have them. Removing nuclear weapons from the base in Guam meant that the Air Force would no longer have long-range nuclear weapons in the Pacific region. To accede to Japanese and Philippine political wishes, nuclear weapons had not been stored at Kadena Air Force Base on Okinawa, nor at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. The United States was reported to have had tactical nuclear weapons deployed in South Korea, where Army troops and Air Force fighter squadrons are stationed. The Air Force would continue to have the right to ship nuclear weapons through Japan, but not to store them or deploy them there. Air Force bombers have not routinely flown with nuclear bombs aboard since the airborne alert ended in 1968. Instead, they had sat on alert at the end of runways at several bases in the United States. The closing of the nuclear storage depots in 1988 was not deemed likely to have any bearing on negotiations over arms control with the Soviet Union, as those negotiations were concerned primarily with the overall numbers of bombs. Rather, the closing related to internal changes in the Air Force. The Strategic Air Command was amid a vast transformation, largely because the new B-1 bomber came into operation that same year. The Air Force had just received the last of its 100 B-1 bombers. As crews completed training, the B-1s were gradually going on nuclear alert at Dyess Air Force Base in Texas, Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota, and McConnell Air Force Base in Kansas. At the same time, Model G and H versions of the older B-52 bombers were being shifted to new missions. Of the 167 G-model B-52s, 98 had been rigged to carry cruise missiles with nuclear warheads, as were about 70 of the H models. Eventually, the remaining 26 H models would be rigged to carry cruise missiles. In a combat mission, they would fly to points about 1,500 miles from their targets to launch the missiles, which are like flying torpedoes with stubby wings, engines, and guidance systems. The planes could also carry conventional bombs and short-range attack missiles. The remaining 69 G models were assigned conventional roles, including carrying Harpoon anti-ship missiles. One squadron of about 15 B-52s based on Guam conducted that mission in the Pacific, and another squadron based in Maine did so for the Atlantic. Thus, nuclear storage depots were closed at both bases. Bombers rigged for conventional missions required different bomb racks and controls, as well as different data in their computers to enable the planes to bomb their targets accurately. Many nuclear bombing missions would be flown at low level, while conventional missions were more likely to be at high altitudes. More changes in bomber missions were expected when the stealth bomber, or B-2, started operations, but that would be at least 4 years later from the time the article was written in May of 1988. The nuclear deterrence mission being eliminated from the 42nd Bombardment Wing was the single greatest decision that doomed Loring Air Force Base. A comparable B-52 base with nuclear weapons was Fairchild Air Force Base in Washington. It too would eventually lose its fleet of B-52H bombers, but not its nuclear storage commitment. Well, at least not at first. That was because in further START treaties with the Soviet Union, it was agreed to remove the B-1 bomber as a carrier in the nuclear deterrence mission. As a result of this agreement, Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota shipped all its nuclear weapons in storage to Fairchild Air Force Base. The nuclear weapons were kept at Fairchild for some time in accordance with the START Treaty, as B-1 bases were not allowed to have nuclear weapons stored nearby, with the B-1 being relegated to a conventional bombing role only. Eventually, in later years, all the nuclear weapons in storage at Fairchild Air Force Base were removed. Fairchild Air Force Base became exclusively an air refueling tanker base and is still in operation today. Could Loring Air Force Base also have become an air refueling tanker base? It was strategically as well suited for such a mission as Fairchild is. The Air Force decided it did not need such a base in the far northeast of the United States, as it already had Air National Guard tanker wings in both Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Bangor, Maine. As previously stated, the site chosen to build Loring Air Force Base was due to its proximity to the Soviet Union. That ideal location became part of its downfall. Due to the proximity to the ocean, as with Mather Air Force Base near Sacramento, California, basing nuclear bombers that close to the shore made them easily accessible to Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missiles.